Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Jesus before Pontius Pilate, part 2, John chapter 19, verses 1 through 16. In the previous chapter, we saw Jesus arrested in Gethsemane. He was betrayed by Judas Iscariot. He went out and spoke to the people. Let these other, you're looking for me, Jesus of Nazareth, let these others go. Peter almost messed it up by trying to do a one-man stand with his sword, cut off the ear of a servant by the name of Malchus. But Jesus stopped that. We don't read about it here, but in one of the other accounts, we read about Jesus healing man. Next, Jesus was taken in chapter 18, verse 12, to the high priest, first to Annas, who was the official high priest. High priest was supposed to be for life. And Peter had followed along with another disciple, and that other disciple got Peter into the building. And from there, Jesus was taken to Caiaphas. I don't think that was probably the same building, same area, but now it was before Caiaphas, who was the son-in-law of Annas, who was the high priest in the eyes of Rome, because they had demanded that Annas step down, and so he was technically the high priest in the eyes of the Jews, but Caiaphas was doing the job now. And we saw Peter's 3 denials, and that was during that trial before the high priest, or if you want to say high priests plural. But then they took Jesus from there to Pontius Pilate. Pilate was the Roman governor, and that started in chapter 18, verse 28. And Pilate asked what charges, and they weren't quite. I think that took them a little bit by surprise. They expected him to rubber stamp their request, and for some reason he doesn't go for it. And so he comes back and he asks Jesus, "Are you a king?" And that had not been one of the charges that they had related um, to Pilate. At least we're not told that it was in that early portion of John chapter 18. And Jesus, and Pilate talk about truth, and Pilate asks the question, "What is truth?" And now he comes out to the crowd, and he says, "How about if I release Jesus to you?" There's a tradition, a practice that apparently the Romans had been observing to release one criminal, and they asked instead for Barabbas. And that's where we ended at the end of chapter 18. As we pick up now, we're going into chapter 19, but Jesus is still before Pilate. So this is going to be Pilate part 2, chapter 19, verse 1. Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him, that is, with some sort of whipping device. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and put a purple robe on him. Now, notice, not so much the scourging, that's just mistreatment all across the board. But the crown of thorns and the purple robe are both designed as mockery. In other words, it's not just a crown, but a crown of thorns. So it's not a good crown, a bad crown. And then the purple robe, that had to cost somebody some funds, because purple was not a normal color that you could just run down to the marketplace and pick up. I think I still have a purple shirt in my closet, and it's nothing spectacular. Purple isn't a big deal for us, but it was back then. And so this is a joke, but it's not just a cruel joke, it's an expensive joke as well, as they are treating Jesus as though he were a king, but they're mocking him and treating him as though he were king of the Jews. And they're not Jewish friendly. These soldiers are Roman soldiers. Verse 3, and they began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews." Again, this is by way of mockery, and to give him slaps, and our translation adds, "in the face." Now, that's an interesting term that's used there. The same word is used in the Septuagint way back in Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 6. But the wording, now, what I did is I gave you the wording here from the New American Standard. I probably should have given you a direct translation instead from the Septuagint, because it's a little bit different. My Hebrew text says, "I gave my back to those who strike me," and you'd expect the word strike would be the word slaps. It's not. But instead, "and my cheeks to those who," and again, my translation says, "pluck out the beard," but there's no word in the Hebrew text for beard there. Instead, it's "my cheeks to those who strike, the sort of, what's the term for it? It's sort of like make it empty. And so the translators said, oh, if I'm going to make my face empty, that means I'm pulling the hair out. Um, but that pluck out part, or slap or strike, um, in order to make his face smooth, but not smooth in a good way. This isn't talking about a nice shave. This is talking about maybe smooth from having been beat up on so much, or might be plucking the beard. Yeah, that could be right. I'm not going to dispute that translation. I'm just saying it's the same word in the Septuagint, in the Greek Septuagint. So chalk it up to either maybe a different way of translating it. I'm not going to say the Septuagint is a bad translation, although sometimes I do have my doubts about it. And sometimes it shows a slightly different Hebrew reading, but I'm not sure that that's the case here. So I just find it interesting that the way they're describing the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, actually uses the same term to describe the suffering of the promised Messiah. That was Isaiah chapter 50, verse 6, just the first part of the verse. And that same term is used here. Continue verse 4. Pilate came out again and said to them, behold, I'm bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. Now, we already read back in chapter 18, verse 38, where Pilate had gone out to the Jews and said, I find no guilt in him. This is the second time now that Pilate is making that proclamation. What do you do with somebody when they're not guilty? You release them. Pilate hasn't released them because there is there's a conflict of wills here. Pilate says there's no guilt in him. The people want him crucified. The Jewish folk, the Jewish leaders and their followers that are there, they want to see him put to death, and Jesus isn't really cooperating with either side. So let's look at that. Verse 5, Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, these objects of derision, these objects of mockery. And notice Pilate, even though it's italicized, he's the one that's been speaking. So he said to them, behold the man. Look at him. Look at the man. Isn't this enough? Look at the man. This is the one who people have been saying, you guys hadn't been, but people have been saying that he's a king. Does he look like a king, or what kind of king does he look like? A crown of thorns, a purple robe, mockery, a face that's been smoothed by the beating. Just take a look. Behold the man. Verse 6, so when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, crucify, crucify. Pilate said to him, take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. A third time. Now, did you capture this? We had 3 times back in chapter 18 that they had asked, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus had said 3 different times, I'm the one, I am he. The third time he wasn't answering their question. I told you that I'm he. He said it a third time. But 3 times we have that statement. And then 3 times we had Peter denying him. I don't know him. I don't know him. And then he says it again. And now for the 3rd time, we have Pilate saying, I find no guilt in him. Verse 7, the Jews answered him, we have a law, and by that law he ought to die because, here it is, here's the Jewish charge against him, because he made himself out to be the Son of God. Now, we've been reading throughout the Gospel of John that Jesus is the Son of God. We've had the Father say it. We've had John the Baptist say it. We've had his disciples say it. We've had John the writer say it. Everyone has said this. He made that Jesus is the Son of God, and we've had all sorts of evidence for it. And the Jews, notice, the Jewish authorities understand the claim, even if they haven't heard Jesus say it. They've had others say it about him. They understand the claim, and they understand the claim correctly. He made himself out to be the Son of God. In that, he's guilty as charged. But that's not a guilt thing if he really is the Son of God. And that's the whole point you're supposed to be seeing in this. So verse 8, therefore, when Pilate heard this statement about he made himself out to be the Son of God, that shakes Pilate up a little bit. He was even more afraid. You know, he'd been wondering, what on earth is this Jesus? He just doesn't seem to fit the mold of just like a regular person. He's not protesting his innocence. He's not threatening. He's just taking us all very calmly. And he entered into the praetorium again, that is the headquarters, and said to Jesus, where are you from? And Jesus has already spoken about where he's from, and he's spoken about the one who the plan here, and he's talked about how his kingdom is not of this world. But now Jesus gives him no answer. So Pilate said to him, do you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you? And because Pilate, in his book, he's the most powerful guy in town. His authority comes from the Roman emperor. And he is not realizing that there is one standing before him who has a greater authority, whose authority doesn't come from a Roman emperor, but who comes from the creator of all the universe. But Pilate doesn't get that. But he's feeling a little uncomfortable. He's feeling a little hemmed in. He's feeling a little trapped because this isn't going the way he wants to. And so he spouts his authority. I almost get the impression that he protesteth too much. I have authority. I have authority to release you. I have authority to crucify you. And Jesus doesn't really act like Pilate has all that much authority, because Jesus is here at the behest of a greater authority. And so verse 11, Jesus answered, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. You want to talk about authority? There is authority, but there's authority that comes from a bigger place, a higher place, authority from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Now, it's not immediately clear. I think we can puzzle it out. Notice the he who delivered me to you. Who is the he? To whom does the pronoun refer? Is it God? In a sense, God had delivered Jesus. God is in control of all things. But I don't think we can say God has the greater sin. Is it Judas Iscariot, who had indeed betrayed Jesus? And yet I would suggest that the one here who has the greater sin is the high priest, because it had been his decision. Now, I think God's still in charge. God's pulling the strings. But it had been the decision of the high priest way back in chapter 11. Then we're upset that we might lose some of our authority. We might lose some of our power from the Romans. And so it's better that one man die. And they had made the decision to have Jesus put to death, not on the basis of evidence, but on the basis of seeking to preserve their own power. Pilate hears this, and now he begins to get very worried. As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. And remember, Caesar was the one who had placed Pilate in his present position. You say, well, I thought the Senate was involved. The Senate did basically whatever Caesar wanted them to do. And Caesar, and we're talking about Tiberius Caesar in this case, he was the emperor in Rome, a very suspicious person, one who's even going to have one of the grandsons of Herod put in prison for not being a loyal enough friend, or so he will think. And I'm speaking of Herod Agrippa, who's going to be imprisoned by Caesar. That hadn't quite happened yet, but that was right around the corner. So notice everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. They're really setting this up. Caesar, let me just say, had allowed for some kings. They were always subservient to him. Caesar wanted to be the guy in power. But still, there were people like Herod the Great had been a king and had been ordained a king, had been made a king by the Roman Senate, and with the approval of people like Octavius, who would later be Caesar Augustus, and Mark Antony. So this is a declaration, and it's enough to make Pilate worried. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat on the judgment seat. Now, notice he sits on the bema. That's the translated judgment seat. Actually, it's the raised platform, but there was probably a seat there. And notice it was a place, and he's on that bematas, that's the word for bema, at a place called the pavement. Now, here we have a Greek term, the lithostroton, the just means the stone, the pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. And we know, the different Latin terms that we've seen. We know this Greek word. Gabbatha is a little bit of a puzzle to us. We write it, it's written in Greek letters because we're reading this in Greek, but we don't know a Hebrew word, Gabbatha. It doesn't really connect. So the meaning here is actually unknown. People have made all sorts of educated guesses, but that's all they are. We simply don't know the meaning of that term. Verse 14, now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. Now, when we read that it was the 6th hour, that's a problem because if we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when you talk about the 6th hour in Jewish time, you're talking about 6 hours after sunrise. And by 6 hours after sunrise, Jesus would already be on the cross and he would have been delivered over a few hours earlier. But here it's the 6th hour, and Jesus has not yet been sent to the cross instead of being on it now for a few hours. So what do we do with this? Well, there was one opinion that tried to say, well, maybe he doesn't go to the cross until the next day. I don't think that's the case. I think that you really have to stretch the passage for that. Secondly, I suppose somebody has said maybe it was a typo that somebody copied it wrong, and he really said this was about the 3rd hour, but somebody copied it wrong, and numbers are easy to mess up, and that part is true. Numbers are sometimes easy to mess up, but I don't think that's the answer either. I think what's happening here, and maybe all through the Gospel of John, whenever a time element is mentioned, is that John is using the Roman system of telling time, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke are using the Hebrew system, Hebrew, and I would say Hebrew and Greek system of telling time. Among the Hebrews, they would measure time, if you're talking about the 6th hour, that's 6 hours after sunrise. Among the Romans, they wouldn't do it that way. What they would do is they would do similar to what we do. After midnight, you count 6 hours, and now you're talking around 6 in the morning. Now, so which is it? And my answer is I'm not sure. I think it might be the Roman time, but again, I can't say for certain, so I'm not going to. So it's about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." Again, is that mockery? Is that to get them to stop? What? I'm not even sure if Pilate knew why he was saying it at this point. Verse 15, so they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" Notice how he hasn't let that go. In fact, he's not going to let that go, even when Jesus goes to the cross. We'll see that next time. "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Really? Remember that they would have prayed earlier that day in the preparation for the Passover. They would have been praying these various psalms, the Hallel psalms. I'm sorry, the yes, the Hallel psalms, psalms of praise, praising God as the King of the universe. And for them to say, "We have no king but Caesar," what they are effectively doing is that they are also denying the God of the universe. They are doing what Simon Peter did. I don't know him. And they are saying the same thing about God. We have no king but Caesar. And what is Pilate going to do? Well, if they're going to confess Caesar as king, remember, Caesar wasn't officially a king, but he was, he served that purpose for as far as they were concerned. And so he then handed him, that is Jesus, over to them to be crucified. Roman soldiers will do it, but they will be along for the ride and they will get what they have requested. Now, some closing observations, and I want to make note of the Passover connection because John the Baptist had described Jesus as the Lamb of God. And Passover was all about a lamb that was slain. Remember how Passover commemorated the release of the Israelites from Egypt. And the trial was now taking place on the preparation day of the Passover. That is, lambs were being brought to the temple and they were being slain, they were being executed, they were being prepared, and the blood drained off, and the bodies taken to prepare a Passover meal. The requirement for the Passover lamb, and this had been taking place in the previous days, was that it be examined to see that it was without blemish. And now Pilate has just spent some considerable time examining Jesus to see that he is without blemish. So he examines Jesus and he indicates, I find no guilt in him. And then he says it again. And a third time, I find no guilt in him. So the Passover lamb, has been examined and has been found to be without spot or blemish. Notice now that the first Passover was an event that takes place in the sentence of death upon every firstborn in Egypt. That is, back in the original Passover, God had said, I'm going to kill every firstborn, whether Egyptian or Israelite, whether man or animal. If it was the first one to be born from its mother, then that man or animal would die. All were under the sentence of death. And the Passover lamb was taken and killed so that any within that household, and the blood applied to the doorposts and to the lintel, and so that the angel of death, as it came over that household, whatever firstborn there was within that household, human, Egyptian, Israelite, animal, the firstborn, instead of being killed, the lamb's death would serve instead as the substitutionary death of that firstborn. So that God here takes his only born son to be our Passover sacrifice. My only question then is this: have you applied the blood? Have you applied the blood? How do you do that? Through faith, by trusting in the one that God sent, that God gave to die in your place. If the blood is applied, then you have been saved.